On April 19, 1995, a quiet morning in Oklahoma City turned into one of the deadliest acts of terrorism in U.S. history. The explosion that rocked the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured over 600. The bombing devastated the community, but it also left a profound scar on the entire nation. The man behind the attack was Timothy McVeigh, a U.S. Army veteran who harbored deep resentment toward the federal government. The bombing he orchestrated targeted the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a government building located in the heart of downtown Oklahoma City. At 9:02 a.m., McVeigh detonated a massive truck bomb filled with explosives, including ammonium nitrate, a fertilizer-based substance. The explosion killed 168 people, including 19 children, and injured over 600 others. The scale of the devastation was almost unimaginable, with survivors later describing scenes of chaos and destruction, the once standing building reduced to rubble in a matter of seconds. McVeigh, a man with a history of anti-government beliefs, sought to strike at the heart of the U.S. government, particularly in the wake of the Waco siege of 1993, where the FBI had engaged in a standoff with the Branch Davidians in Texas. McVeigh believed that the U.S. government had overstepped its bounds, and the Waco incident, where more than 80 people, including children, were killed, became a rallying point for his ideological beliefs. McVeigh was determined to make a statement, not just about his personal anger toward the government, but as a symbol of resistance against what he saw as an oppressive state. The choice of the Murrah Federal Building as the target was deliberate. McVeigh knew it housed federal agents, but he also knew that the building's location would cause maximum devastation. The bombing was meticulously planned, with McVeigh studying how to construct a bomb that would cause maximum destruction. He built the device in a rented storage facility, taking careful precautions to ensure it would detonate at the right moment. The attack shocked the nation, and the discovery of McVeigh's identity as the bomber added a layer of complexity to the incident. McVeigh was not part of an international terrorist organization. He was a lone individual, driven by personal grievances and radical anti-government beliefs. His act of violence was not just a symbol of political protest, but of an increasing domestic threat that could strike at any moment, hidden in plain sight. In the aftermath, McVeigh was quickly apprehended, convicted, and sentenced to death. Ted Kaczynski, better known as the Unabomber, represents one of the most chilling cases of domestic terrorism in U.S. history. His campaign of violence, which spanned nearly 2 decades, was marked by a series of bombings that killed 3 people and injured 23 others. But unlike McVeigh's public explosion, Kaczynski's terrorism was quiet, slow, and calculated, delivered through the mail, wrapped in personal ideological messages. Kaczynski was a former mathematics prodigy who, after a series of personal failures, retreated into isolation in a cabin in the Montana wilderness. It was there that he developed a radical theory about technology's dehumanizing effects and began to send out bombs to university professors, airline executives, and others he felt contributed to the technological advancements he despised. For nearly 2 decades, Kaczynski sent homemade bombs to universities, airlines, and other institutions associated with technology and its advancement. His bombs killed 3 people and injured 23 others. During this time, Kaczynski carefully crafted a manifesto titled Industrial Society and Its Future, in which he outlined his belief that technology was enslaving humanity and that revolution was the only way to prevent it. He demanded that his manifesto be published in exchange for stopping his bombings. His writings, filled with apocalyptic warnings about the consequences of unchecked technological progress, seemed outlandish to many, but they were undeniably persuasive to a select few. Kaczynski's hatred for modern society, combined with his methodical planning, made him a terrifying figure in the history of domestic terrorism. Kaczynski's decision to publish his manifesto would lead to his downfall. After extensive pressure from the FBI and the public, he agreed to the terms of his publication request, but he demanded that the manifesto be printed by major newspapers. In September 1995, The Washington Post and The New York Times published the manifesto. The publication of his ideas sparked a national debate about technology, society, and personal freedom, but it also led to a breakthrough for the FBI. In 1996, after Kaczynski's manifesto was published, the FBI was able to narrow down the suspect to a solitary figure. Kaczynski was arrested in 1996 and later pleaded guilty to all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the history of terrorism, few names carry the weight of Osama bin Laden. The leader of Al-Qaeda, the extremist group responsible for the September 11, 2001 attacks, bin Laden's influence shaped not just the modern world's understanding of terrorism, but also the United States' approach to security, foreign policy, and counterterrorism. Born in 1957 in Saudi Arabia, Osama bin Laden came from a wealthy family with close ties to the Saudi royal family. His early life was marked by both privilege and religious devotion, two elements that would later converge into the radical ideology that would fuel his rise as one of the world's most infamous figures. Bin Laden was educated in Saudi Arabia and later in Afghanistan, where he developed his vision of jihad, a violent, radical interpretation of Islam aimed at overthrowing governments in the Middle East that he viewed as corrupt and subservient to the West. Bin Laden's story is closely linked to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in the 1980s. It was during this period that he became deeply involved in the Afghan Mujahideen's fight against Soviet forces. Here, he established himself as both a financier and a leader, using his family's wealth to fund the insurgents. It was in these formative years that bin Laden's beliefs about jihad and global Islamic rule began to take shape. However, bin Laden's ultimate goal was not limited to Afghanistan. After the Soviet withdrawal in 1989, bin Laden's focus shifted to the United States, which he saw as the ultimate enemy of Islam due to its military presence in the Middle East, especially in Saudi Arabia. Bin Laden began forming Al-Qaeda, meaning the base, in the late 1980s, with the intent of waging a global jihad against the West. For years, bin Laden and his group operated under the radar, carrying out smaller attacks, such as the 1998 U.S. embassy bombings in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed over 200 people. But it was the September 11 attacks that would etch his name in history forever. On the morning of September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists affiliated with Al-Qaeda hijacked 4 commercial airliners. 2 planes were flown into the World Trade Center towers in New York City, a third into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and a 4th crashed into a field in Pennsylvania after passengers attempted to retake control of the plane. The attacks killed nearly 3,000 people, making it the deadliest terrorist act in world history. Bin Laden's planning for the 9/11 attacks was meticulous. Al-Qaeda operatives were trained in hijacking and combat, using the United States' own infrastructure to carry out the assault. Bin Laden's role as the mastermind was clear, and for years afterward, the U.S. government made capturing him a top priority. In the aftermath of 9/11, the U.S. led an international coalition to invade Afghanistan, where Al-Qaeda was based, and overthrow the Taliban regime that had harbored bin Laden. The U.S. response included a global war on terror, which led to military engagements in Iraq, heightened security measures in airports, and the expansion of intelligence operations worldwide. But despite the invasion of Afghanistan, bin Laden evaded capture for nearly a decade. It wasn't until May 2, 2011, that U.S. Navy SEALs tracked bin Laden to a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. In a daring nighttime raid, bin Laden was killed, and his body was buried at sea. In the early months of 2002, a wave of terror swept through the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area, leaving residents in fear of the unseen threat that seemed to strike at random. The Beltway sniper attacks, carried out by John Allen Muhammad and his accomplice, Lee Boyd Malvo, became one of the most chilling and perplexing series of shootings in modern U.S. history. Muhammad, a former U.S. Army soldier, and Malvo, a teenager whom he had mentored, went on a months-long killing spree that paralyzed the D.C. area. They used a modified car trunk as a sniper's perch, positioning themselves in the back of a blue Chevrolet Caprice to shoot victims at random. Between October 2nd and October 24, 2002, the pair carried out 10 attacks, killing 10 people and injuring several others. What made the attacks so terrifying was not only the random nature of the shootings, but the fact that Muhammad and Malvo were operating with military precision. Muhammad had served in the army, and his training in tactics allowed him to plan and execute the attacks with careful calculation. The killings occurred in public places, gas stations, parking lots, and schools, with no warning and no clear motive. As the attacks continued, panic spread throughout the D.C. area. Law enforcement and federal authorities struggled to find leads, as the sniper seemed to be able to disappear into the crowd after each attack. The media frenzy intensified, with news outlets showing every new victim and discussing the possibility of a serial killer, a terrorist plot, or an act of political extremism. The attacks created a sense of vulnerability, as no one knew who would be next or where the sniper would strike. The investigation took several weeks before a breakthrough occurred. On October 24, 2002, after a tip from a member of the public, law enforcement officers managed to track down Muhammad and Malvo in their car at a highway rest stop in Maryland. The two were arrested without incident, and the end of the sniper attacks brought a sense of relief to the frightened public. The motive behind the attacks. At the time of his arrest, John Allen Muhammad claimed that the shootings were part of a larger plot to launch a revenge against his ex-wife, whom he had been involved in a lengthy custody battle over their children. However, the true motive behind the attacks remains shrouded in confusion, as Muhammad and Malvo had both shown signs of instability and were influenced by various ideological beliefs. Muhammad was eventually convicted of 6 murders and sentenced to death in 2003. His accomplice, Malvo, was also convicted and sentenced to life in prison without parole. Malvo's young age at the time of the attacks, 17, led to a long legal battle over his sentence, with the U.S. Supreme Court eventually ruling that life sentences for juveniles convicted of murder could be subject to review. The Beltway sniper attacks remain a haunting reminder of how terror can take many forms. Not always foreign, not always ideological, but sometimes the result of deeply personal grievances and the decisions of individuals who snap under the weight of their own unresolved issues. Anwar al-Awlaki represents one of the most troubling figures in the context of global terrorism. A U.S.-born imam, al-Awlaki's journey from a religious leader in Yemen to a prominent figure in the global jihadist movement highlights the complex relationship between radical ideology and the power of the internet to spread extremist thought. Born in New Mexico in 1971 to Yemeni parents, al-Awlaki grew up in the United States before moving to Yemen as a young adult. Initially, he was seen as a moderate voice in the Muslim community, even earning respect in academic circles and religious communities. However, as the years went by, al-Awlaki's views shifted dramatically toward extremism. After the September 11th attacks, al-Awlaki became increasingly vocal in his radicalization. While he had no direct involvement in the planning of the attacks, he was believed to have had links to several individuals connected to al-Qaeda, including the 2009 Fort Hood shooter, Nidal Hassan, and the 2009 Christmas Day bomber, Umar Farouk Abdul Muttalab. He became a key figure in al-Qaeda's propaganda efforts, utilizing the internet and social media to spread his message of jihad. Al-Awlaki's influence was largely due to his ability to speak to Western audiences in fluent English, giving him a unique role in the global jihadist movement. Through online lectures, videos, and audio recordings, he preached a message of violent resistance to Western governments, particularly the United States, encouraging Muslims to take up arms against perceived enemies of Islam. In addition to his role as an ideological leader, al-Awlaki also served as a recruiter for al-Qaeda. His online presence inspired numerous individuals to carry out terrorist attacks or attempt to join the group, including Abdul Muttalab, who tried to detonate explosives on a flight to Detroit in 2009. Despite his growing notoriety, al-Awlaki remained elusive, operating from his hideout in Yemen, where he was protected by local tribes and the political instability of the region. For years, the U.S. government struggled to track him down. But in 2011, after a lengthy manhunt, al-Awlaki was targeted by a U.S. drone strike and killed in Yemen. The death of al-Awlaki raised difficult questions about the balance between national security and the rights of individuals, as he was a U.S. citizen, and his killing without trial sparked significant debate. His death, however, was seen as a significant blow to al-Qaeda's ability to recruit and inspire attacks against the West. When Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi declared himself the Caliph of the Islamic State in 2014, the world watched in disbelief as the group he led, ISIS, swept across Syria and Iraq, capturing vast territories and causing unprecedented chaos. Al-Baghdadi's rise to power and his ability to unite a loose coalition of extremists under one banner demonstrated the devastating potential of radical ideologies in a deeply divided region. Al-Baghdadi's journey from obscurity to infamy began in the 1990s. Born in Iraq in 1971, al-Baghdadi grew up during a period of political and religious turmoil in the Middle East. After earning a doctorate in Islamic studies, al-Baghdadi became a member of al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, an extremist group led by Abu Musab al-Zarqawi. Following Zarqawi's death in 2006, al-Baghdadi gradually rose through the ranks of AQI, eventually becoming the group's leader in 2010 after a series of leadership changes. Al-Baghdadi's rise to power was marked by his ability to forge alliances with other extremist groups, including the Nusra Front in Syria. However, his most significant achievement came in 2013, when he declared the formation of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, a self-declared caliphate that he led as its caliph. His declaration was a bold move, as it challenged the existing jihadist leadership, particularly al-Qaeda, and aimed to create a new, more radical vision of Islamic governance. Under al-Baghdadi's leadership, ISIS launched a brutal campaign of territorial expansion, capturing key cities like Mosul in Iraq and Raqqa in Syria. The group's methods were ruthless. They imposed strict interpretations of Islamic law, executed thousands of civilians, and engaged in widespread atrocities, including the destruction of cultural heritage sites. The group also became known for its sophisticated propaganda campaign, utilizing social media to recruit foreign fighters and inspire terrorist attacks worldwide. The rise of ISIS under al-Baghdadi was a wake-up call for the international community. The group's reach was global, with individuals from around the world flocking to Iraq and Syria to join the so-called caliphate. Al-Baghdadi's charisma and ability to portray himself as the leader of a new, global jihadist movement made him one of the most dangerous and influential figures in contemporary terrorism. However, As the US-led coalition launched airstrikes against ISIS, the group began to lose territory. In 2017, al-Baghdadi's influence waned further as Iraqi and Syrian forces, with the support of international forces, recaptured key cities from ISIS. Despite the setbacks, al-Baghdadi continued to elude capture, moving between different hideouts in Syria and Iraq. Finally, on October 26, 2019, al-Baghdadi's life came to a violent end. U.S. Special Forces located his compound in northwest Syria, and during a raid, al-Baghdadi detonated an explosive device, killing himself and 2 of his children. His death marked a significant blow to ISIS, but the group remains a major threat, with many of its followers continuing to operate in the shadows. Al-Baghdadi's legacy is one of brutality, manipulation, and death. His leadership of ISIS left an indelible mark on the Middle East and the world, and while his death weakened the group, ISIS's ideology continues to inspire violence worldwide. In the tumultuous 1960s and 1970s, America faced widespread social and political upheaval. The civil rights movement, anti-Vietnam War protests, and the fight for gender equality marked a period of intense activism. However, among the many movements of the time, the Weather Underground Organization, WO, stood out for its radical approach to resistance. Formed in 1969 as a faction of the Students for a Democratic Society, SDS, the Weather Underground emerged out of frustration with the pace of social change and the perceived failures of peaceful protest. The group believed that the U.S. government was a violent, imperialist force, particularly due to its involvement in the Vietnam War, and that direct action, including violence, was necessary to achieve meaningful change. Their goal was to overthrow the U.S. government and end the war through an armed revolution. At its core, the Weather Underground was a group of young, mostly white, middle-class radicals who became disillusioned with traditional political channels. They drew inspiration from global revolutionary movements, particularly the Cuban and Chinese revolutions. They sought to create an underground militant group that would take decisive action against American imperialism. The group's philosophy was heavily influenced by the writings of Karl Marx and Frantz Fanon, but also by the urgency of stopping the violence they saw in Vietnam. The Weather Underground's most notorious tactic was bombing. They believed that by targeting government buildings and symbols of American power, they could send a message that the government's violence would not go unchallenged. Over the years, they were responsible for bombings at locations such as the U.S. Capitol, the Pentagon, and several government buildings in New York City. Their first major bombing campaign occurred in 1970, when they detonated bombs at the U.S. Capitol, and later at the Pentagon. While no one was killed in the early attacks, the bombings caused extensive property damage and heightened fear among the American public. The Weather Underground claimed these attacks were symbolic gestures designed to expose the hypocrisy and violence of the U.S. government. However, as the group carried out more bombings and became more violent, their actions began to attract greater attention from law enforcement. The FBI classified the Weather Underground as a domestic terrorist organization in 1970, leading to widespread investigations. Despite this, the group managed to operate in secrecy for years, hiding under the radar and using aliases to avoid capture. In 1971, the group issued a statement declaring war on the U.S. government. Their radical methods and rhetoric mirrored the revolutionary zeal of other global movements, but their violence increasingly alienated them from mainstream American society. The bombing campaign reached its peak in the early 1970s, with a particularly brutal bombing of the U.S. Capitol in 1971, which damaged the Senate chamber. However, after a bombing in 1972, the group began to splinter. Several members were arrested, and many went into hiding. For years, the Weather Underground operated in secrecy, but their ideological commitment remained intact. They continued to push for violent revolution, believing that the U.S. government would only be toppled through an armed struggle. They attempted to justify their violence by claiming it was a response to the violence and oppression perpetrated by the state. In the late 1970s and 1980s, as the group lost its ideological footing and many of its leaders were arrested, the Weather Underground essentially ceased to exist as a functioning organization. However, their impact was far-reaching. The group had radicalized a generation of activists who sought to challenge authority and fight for a more just society. Their acts of violence, while controversial, inspired many future radical movements in the U.S. and abroad. In the years following their disbandment, some former members of the Weather Underground reintegrated into society. Many became political activists, academics, and writers, and several expressed regret for their violent methods. Despite their disavowal of terrorism, the legacy of the Weather Underground continues to stir debate, particularly regarding the use of violence in the fight for social change. In the 1960s, America was a country at war with itself. The civil rights movement had gained momentum, but so had the police brutality, systemic racism, and inequality that perpetuated the suffering of African Americans. Amidst this turmoil, a group of young men and women, determined to protect their communities and demand justice, formed what would become one of the most influential and controversial organizations in American history, the Black Panther Party, BPP. Founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale in Oakland, California, the BPP began as a response to police brutality and the mistreatment of African Americans by law enforcement. Initially, the group's goals were centered around self-defense and protection. The Panthers carried firearms to monitor police activity, particularly in low-income neighborhoods where police often used excessive force. The group's slogan was clear: freedom, justice, and equality. However, the Black Panther Party's ambitions quickly expanded. Inspired by revolutionary leaders like Malcolm X and Fidel Castro, the BPP adopted a Marxist-Leninist ideology and began to advocate for a complete overhaul of the U.S. political and economic systems. They believed that the American government had failed Black Americans, and that the only way to achieve true equality was through radical, systemic change. The BPP's revolutionary rhetoric caught the attention of many, but their tactics were controversial. The Panthers took direct action, organizing armed patrols and challenging police authority. Their public displays of armed resistance were both praised by the communities they served and feared by government officials, who saw them as a threat to national security. The FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, considered the Panthers one of the biggest domestic threats to national security, and initiated a covert campaign to undermine and destroy the organization. This effort, part of the FBI's COINTELPRO operation, involved surveillance, harassment, and infiltration of the BPP by government agents. Despite the government's efforts, the Black Panther Party gained significant national recognition. The party's influence spread across the country, establishing chapters in cities from New York to Chicago, and they became a symbol of Black power and resistance. The BPP's 10-point program outlined their demands for justice, including an end to police brutality, the right to decent housing, full employment, and an end to the exploitation of Black Americans by the capitalist system. They also launched a series of social programs aimed at improving the living conditions of poor African Americans, such as free breakfast programs for children, health clinics, and education programs. While the Black Panther Party was primarily focused on Black liberation, their rhetoric and actions spoke to larger revolutionary ideals. The Panthers believed that their struggle was part of a global movement for the oppressed, and they sought solidarity with other revolutionary movements around the world. Their calls for unity with groups like the Young Lords and American Indian Movement, AIM, reflected their broader vision for a more just and equitable society. However, internal divisions and external pressure took their toll. By the early 1970s, the BPP began to fragment. Some members were arrested or killed in violent confrontations with the police, while others, like Eldridge Cleaver and Fred Hampton, left the group or were silenced. The FBI's relentless efforts to disband the organization, along with growing public concerns over the Panthers' increasingly radical stance, led to a sharp decline in their influence. In 1982, Huey Newton was killed in a shooting, and the Black Panther Party officially disbanded in the mid-1970s. But the impact of the BPP was far-reaching. Their revolutionary ideas continue to inspire social justice movements today. The Black Panther Party's focus on empowering marginalized communities and fighting against systemic oppression helped lay the groundwork for future activism, including the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement. While the Black Panther Party's legacy is complicated, with both admirable achievements and controversial methods, they remain one of the most significant forces in the history of civil rights in America. In the shadow of the Cold War, a complex web of politics, ideology, and violence took shape across the Americas. Among the figures who emerged from this turbulent period was Luis Posada Carriles, a Cuban exile whose actions would earn him the label of one of the most notorious figures in international terrorism. Born in Cuba in 1928, Posada Carriles fled the country after Fidel Castro's 1959 revolution overthrew the Cuban government. Like many Cuban exiles, he sought refuge in the United States, where he became involved in anti-Castro activities. However, unlike many of his fellow exiles, Posada Carriles would not just engage in political resistance, he would also resort to violence as a means of achieving his goals. Posada Carriles initially worked with the CIA in the 1960s during covert operations aimed at overthrowing the Castro regime. He participated in the Bay of Pigs invasion and was involved in multiple assassination attempts against Castro. Despite these actions, Posada Carriles maintained close ties with anti-Castro groups and was able to operate with a degree of impunity for many years. However, it was in the 1970s and 1980s that Posada Carriles' activities would take a darker turn. In 1976, he masterminded the bombing of a Cuban airliner, Cubana Flight 455, which killed 73 people. This act of terrorism, carried out in conjunction with other Cuban exiles, was one of the deadliest attacks attributed to Posada Carriles. It was a clear message that he and his allies were willing to use terrorism to fight the Cuban government, regardless of the innocent lives it would cost. The bombing of Cubana Flight 455 was just one of many violent acts that Posada Carriles would be linked to over the years. He was also implicated in multiple bombing campaigns in Latin America, where he sought to destabilize governments sympathetic to Castro. His actions were not just acts of revenge, but also attempts to create a broader political crisis in the region where the US and Cuba were locked in an ideological and geopolitical struggle. Despite being arrested and tried in connection with these acts, Posada Carriles was able to avoid serious punishment. After the bombing of Cubana Flight 455, he was arrested in Venezuela, where he had been living for several years. However, he managed to escape from a Venezuelan prison in 1985 with the help of sympathizers. This dramatic escape was just the beginning of a new chapter in his life, as Posada Carriles continued to evade justice for many years. In the 1990s, Posada Carriles resurfaced in the United States, where he sought asylum, claiming that his actions were motivated by his opposition to communism and the Castro regime. However, his past continued to haunt him, and he was eventually arrested by U.S. authorities in 2005 for immigration violations. Despite his lengthy history of terrorism, the U.S. government never formally charged him with the crimes of terrorism, a decision that sparked outrage among the families of the victims of his bombings and those who had suffered from his violent actions. Luis Posada Carriles' story is one of the many that illustrate the tangled relationship between terrorism, politics, and the personal motivations of those who choose violence. His life serves as a reminder of how personal vendettas, ideological beliefs, and geopolitical struggles can combine to create dangerous, violent outcomes. While he died in 2018 without facing full justice for his crimes, his legacy remains a testament to the brutal lengths to which some individuals will go to achieve their political goals. Terrorism, in all its forms, has always existed in the shadows, an ideology nurtured by hate, fear, and the desire to disrupt the established order. The U.S. has faced many threats on its soil, from foreign operatives to homegrown radicals, each leaving a lasting impact on the nation's psyche and policies. The stories of men like Timothy McVeigh, Ted Kaczynski, and Osama bin Laden highlight the persistence of terrorism, while others like the Weather Underground and Luis Posada Carriles show the diverse motivations and methods employed by those seeking to make their voices heard or to enact change through violence. But what is perhaps most striking about these figures and events is the way each one has shaped U.S. counterterrorism efforts. After 9/11, the U.S. government underwent a massive overhaul of its security infrastructure, creating agencies like the Department of Homeland Security and expanding the surveillance and intelligence gathering capabilities of organizations such as the FBI and the CIA. These changes were designed to prevent future attacks, but they also sparked debates about the balance between security and personal freedoms. The rise of homegrown terrorism has been another key issue for U.S. counterterrorism efforts. The Oklahoma City bombing, carried out by Timothy McVeigh, showed the world that the U.S. was not immune to radicalized citizens resorting to violence. Similarly, the lone wolf attacks by the Unabomber and the Beltway sniper demonstrated the challenges of detecting and stopping individuals who blend into society and act alone. These cases raised the question, how can a society protect itself when the threat comes from within? The answer lies in a combination of intelligence, vigilance, and community involvement. The U.S. has worked to improve its ability to track and monitor threats, especially as extremist groups have shifted from large, organized cells to more decentralized networks of individuals and small cells. The growth of the internet and social media has made this task more difficult, but it has also provided new tools for counterterrorism agencies to monitor and intervene before attacks can occur. Another key development in the fight against terrorism has been the domestic radicalization of individuals. As seen with the rise of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, American citizens can be recruited and radicalized online, sometimes without ever leaving the country. This has led to new efforts to understand and disrupt the radicalization process. Countering violent extremism programs have been implemented at both local and national levels, working with communities to identify potential threats before they turn violent. While terrorism will never be fully eradicated, the U.S. has made strides in adapting its laws, policies, and strategies to combat both foreign and domestic terrorism. Through a combination of proactive intelligence, community engagement, and international cooperation, the U.S. is better prepared to prevent future attacks. But even as these strategies evolve, the question remains: how does a nation balance security with the freedoms that make it strong? The events of the past, the Oklahoma City bombing, the rise of radical groups, the rise of violent extremism at home and abroad, all show how quickly the balance between liberty and security can be disrupted. As we look to the future, the U.S. continues to confront the challenges posed by both internal and external threats. The story of terrorism in America is still being written, and while there may be new threats on the horizon, the resilience of the American people and the lessons learned from the past will shape the country's response for years to come. In the end, terrorism is not just about violence. It is about fear, division, and the attempt to change the course of history through destruction. And while the U.S. has faced its darkest moments, it remains a symbol of the strength that arises when communities stand together, in defiance of terror and in pursuit of peace.